Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Strombaum. I'm chair of the Manchester NAACP branch's health committee. And Manchester NAACP has just celebrated our 60th anniversary. We're part of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is the nation's largest and oldest racial justice organization. And we just had our 115th anniversary. Anyway, you may have heard of NAACP in various ways, but one way in particular, if you've heard the case Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, who later became a Supreme Court justice, was the legal representative for NAACP, and he argued that case in front of the Supreme Court with NAACP backing, just to give you an idea of what NAACP does. Today, we're going to have a workshop called Death by 1,000 NICs, the impact of race-based traumatic stress and steps for healing. This will be presented by Nicole Sublette, who you can see up there on the screen, who's a licensed mental health counselor in Manchester. She has a practice called Therapists of Color New England, and she will present this, and also Dr. Scott Brizard, who's a licensed pharmacist, will take part in this, because we're going to do this as a conversation. So Scott and Nicole will be talking. Scott will interview Nicole, ask questions, but we also want you to take part as well. So if you have questions or something comes up that you note and it relates to something in your life and you want to make a comment about that, please just put that in the chat. And we will get to I will monitor the chat, Scott will monitor the chat, and we will do our best to get all of your questions and comments in. And this, as I said before, here it is now on the slide. This is presented by Manchester NAACP, the New England Pharmaceutical Society, co-sponsoring this with us, and we're ready to go. So I'll introduce to you Dr. Scott Brizard and our main presenter, Nicole Sublette.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start out by thanking you for joining us today. You could have been anywhere today, but you chose to be here with us to start this important conversation regarding the impact of race-based traumatic stress. But we're not just going to talk about the problems that we experience on a day-to-day, but we're also going to talk about some steps, some steps to healing. And so part of our goal is for you to walk away with an understanding, and some takeaways that we'd like you to walk away with is to have a deeper understanding of how subtle racism impacts our health, some practical tools to address race-based trauma in our own life, on day-to-day life, and strategies for reclaiming joy in the face of systematic oppression. So we'll try to outline a roadmap for healing in regards to our own unique experiences. I'll be sharing some of my own experiences. Nicole and I will be having this conversation, and you will join us as well. So if you look at your Zoom, you will see at the bottom there is the comments for you to make some comments, share your experiences with us, or if you have any question while we are speaking, please feel free to add that in the comment section, and we will address that in the chat. Okay? Excellent. Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone that has taken the time to show up here today, as Scott said. So again, my name is Nicole Sublette. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I have a practice called Therapists of Color New England. We are a multicultural, diverse practice, and we serve everybody across the state. And I also just want to say that I'm really excited to be here because we're going to be engaging in a conversation. I've done a lot of presentations, I've done a lot of speaking, and I find that when we're actually engaging in conversations and also doing some self-reflection, it really helps us to, one, retain the knowledge, but also to actualize change within ourselves. And so I'm super excited. This also being said is that we're talking about race-based traumatic stress. It's not an easy conversation. So for folks who are listening to this conversation, please care for yourself. If you have to get up, move around, take a break, get some water, get some food. I mean, you're all off camera, so I mean, you can do what you want, but just remember, these are hard conversations to take care of yourself. These conversations can be triggering, so I want to give a trigger warning. Some of the content you might find triggering. Also, just to say that no space is a safe space, and so we're going to just do our best to create a brave space. And also think about it, we're in here, even though you're asking questions, think about also the other participants, and we need to do our best to honor one another. So I just want to start with that first.
Excellent. Well, that's great. I'm glad that you mentioned that we'll be talking about race-based trauma and how some of this might be triggering. I guess one of the first thing we can start addressing is how do you define trauma?
Yeah, so trauma, well, there's an official way to define it, and that's according to the American Psychological Association. And what they consider trauma to be is an emotional response to a terrible event, such as an accident, a sexual assault, a natural disaster. And so what happens in a trauma, typically immediately after the event, shock and denial happen. And so we can all experience traumas on different levels. It doesn't have to be a major event. It can be small. Trauma is defined by the individual. However, we can all have a trauma, but we might not experience what is called post-traumatic stress disorder. What that means is that we experience a trauma, and then we notice maybe like a month later or so that we're kind of still living in that space of trauma. We haven't really moved forward from what we've experienced happening to us. And so that's kind of where, in a little bit, I'm going to kind of drill into what is trauma, what is race-based traumatic stress.
I'm glad you mentioned the physical aspect of a trauma and you mentioned PTSD. I remember a few years back, maybe like 10 years ago, I was on 93, driving on 93 South, and a car rear-ended me. And this was on the slow lane. You know, to this day, when I drive and pass by that exit, I remember that, and I instinctively just go away from that lane and just drive because it brings back what happened. And I can see how this relates a lot to race-based traumatic stress, because a lot of us, regardless what culture we're from or what race we are, since we live in a society here in this country that's very race-based, very divisive. So a lot of us can say we have experienced it to some extent, and how it impacts us and how we carry that internally will have its impact how we interact with the rest of the world. And so when I think about that, I think about my own experiences, and in conversations with you in the past, I've mentioned things that seem to be intentionally good turned out to be something that wasn't necessarily good. Like, for example, we talked about in the past how my own experience in the past when I started going to college, and it has been my experience most of my college life that I have been the only person of color in the class, if not the only Black man in the class. And whenever I would speak or something in writing, perhaps in my English class, you know, I would get good points, and in the comments, or either verbally or on paper, oh, that's very articulate, Scott. You're very articulate. And when I first heard that, the first time I heard that was right out of high school. I really didn't think anything of it until I started hearing it more and more frequently. And it was often in spaces where I was the only Black person there. And it became, it, I became to realize that this was perhaps a trend in terms of expectations about myself. So now, because of this experience, now whenever I hear the word uh, articulate, it brings me back to some of the experiences that I have had with people saying that because of their expectations. I don't know if the expectations was less. I tend to think of myself that I present myself pretty well, and how I present myself is no different from my peers. So it always made me wonder, why am I being singled out in class to say, "Oh, that's very articulate." It seems like a compliment, but it also seems like a backhanded compliment at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And it is a backhanded compliment. Why is it a backhanded compliment? Because when someone expresses how articulate you are, it goes back to historically that people tend to express surprise when a Black person is articulate, because how we've been portrayed in the past, there's a lot of stereotypes about different races, but one stereotype portrayed about Black folks is they're not highly intelligent, and they're lazy and they're stupid. And so when someone honors your being articulate, they're like, oh, wow, you're really articulate. I have definitely heard that in my own experiences. Oh, Nicole, you're really articulate, is typically prefaced or thought for a Black woman. And so it's that surprise. So it's actually what is called that would be kind of in the vein of microaggression, but talking about going back here, talking about trauma, like when you explained the car accident, it could be highly possible that you develop PTSD. What does PTSD look like? PTSD looks like avoiding reminders of a traumatic event, persistent negative thoughts and feelings, arousal reactive symptoms, which means like a hypervigilance, like, oh, I'm driving past that corner, I'm feeling a little tense, startle reactions, jumping at loud noises, and then also intrusive thoughts, such as nightmares can manifest as an intrusion, and the same with flashbacks as well. So those are the symptoms of PTSD. Now, if we tie this into race-based traumatic stress, and then we can also tie it to kind of what happened in the classroom, is that when we experience something that we deem as traumatic, and we experience something that we deem as traumatic as it relates to our race and how we look, that can be considered a race-based traumatic stress. But it cannot necessarily, though, be defined as PTSD. Why it can't be defined as PTSD is because typically if we're looking at the DSM-5, and that's how we therapists diagnose folks with anxiety, depression, etc., is that it requires what is called a criterion event, meaning something happened, a car accident happened, you have subsequent symptoms, such as avoiding reminders and negative thoughts. With race-based traumatic stress, it tends to be ongoing and chronic, right? There's not necessarily that criterion A event. And so in the case when you're talking about this is what's happening in the classroom, and you're being defined as articulate with surprise that you are, that is an ongoing event. It wasn't one single, it could be multiple.
Right. I mean, that's one of the reasons why this workshop is called Death by a Thousand Nicks, not Death by One Nick, right?
Right.
It's cumulative. And once one thing happened, because we've been living in this type of society for so long, I think that one thing as people of color is that we accept it. And kind of like when you think about your grandparents, and I've had friends who say the same thing. Well, they're from another time. Nothing you can do about it. You can't change them. And a lot of us feel the same way about our current situation in modern time, that we accept it, And then it's our job, our individual job, to learn how to deal with it versus having a systemic approach to fixing it. And it's curious that you mentioned PTSD is clinically defined versus race-based traumatic stress can't be described under PTSD, even though race-based traumatic stress leads to PTSD because of those traumatic experiences. And it reminded me of a show. But go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to actually, you said something that's incredibly critical, and I want to actually tie this into a systems perspective here, is race-based traumatic stress, right? Even though the symptoms are the same, you cannot be diagnosed with race-based traumatic stress. You can be diagnosed with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
However, this becomes a problem systemically as well. Why? If someone is coming to get services, right, from a mental health provider or seeing a prescriber for medications, right, when you get a service, you need a medical reason to get that service. Now, the DSM has these things, it's called Z codes, right? Where someone doesn't have a medical diagnosis. And a Z code could be like distress with an intimate partner. So you're having like a conflict in your relationship. One of the Z codes is perceived experiences of racism. However, as a practitioner who has tried to bill with a Z code, insurance companies do not cover it.
Yeah.
They will cover PTSD, but they will not cover someone who is struggling, who needs services because they are experiencing racism and discrimination. Insurance companies do not see that as a medical necessity. So I kind of wanted to pause there. I didn't mean to jump in and talk over you, but
no, actually that goes perfectly into what I was about to describe. So there was this psychiatrist, as a matter of fact, and so a lot of acute care hospitals tend to have units that are designated units for people with mental health who needs mental health care. Some of them, some of these hospitals don't just provide medication; they also provide activities, assessment. Like try to integrate their patients into everyday activities, into everyday life. And this particular psychiatrist, he had a patient come in who is a male of the who is from the Latinx community, and this was a high school student. And this high school student came in with his parents, and he's having anxiety, depression, and he's trying to diagnose this child, trying to find out the source of his anxiety and why he's having nightmares at night, and etc. And so what he did is that he admitted this child into the unit while he studies the child some more, do some more assessment. And something happened where the police was bringing another patient in to the unit, and immediately once that child saw the police officer, the psychiatrist noticed his reaction, and the police were white, and there were a lot of other white people around. And that's when he realized that, wait a minute, his anxiety, he was fine with me, and he was fine around my assistant, who was also white, and some of my coworkers, but suddenly he's having this anxiety. Is this anxiety because of the police? Further investigation made him realize that this child is having some race-based traumatic anxiety. And so his diagnosis was anxiety and stress and depression due to racism. And then he goes to find an ICD code, a code to put it under so that the child can stay at the hospital so that they can help him, but couldn't find any codes for that. And he even went and talked to billing and coding. He's like, I want to diagnose this under racism. Is there something for this? And he got a lot of pushback saying there is no such thing. Racism is not the effects of racism is not a medical issue. It has zero impact on people's mental health or their physical health or anything like that. So he ended up having to choose a different type of code in order to keep the child under his care and assess him some more and help him find steps to I wouldn't say overcome the racism, but to deal with it in a more constructive way versus pulling out and pulling away from society, because that's what that child wanted to do. They didn't want to go to school or anything like that. So the story that I just mentioned to you is totally fictional. This is something from a show called New Amsterdam. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of it or has seen it. It takes place in New York City. And when I saw that episode, I thought to myself, wow, that right there is really deep, because I've always thought about things in that way, because I myself, I know when I am around in an area where I know there's a lot of racism there, that my heart rate is elevated. I'm anxious. I have a fight or flight response, and I can imagine if you live in a state like this all the time, it will almost feel like you're in a state of war, in a war zone all the time. So then your body just stays in that hyperactive condition for a longer period of time, which will lead to hypertension, heart issues, and etc. So just that alone should be a reason why race-based trauma should be assessed in a way that it's placed as a diagnosis, like a medical diagnosis. That's my opinion, based on my experiences and what I have seen. But it's just funny that that's not regarded as a legitimate medical reason by the insurance company.
Yeah, and this being said too, so it's not regarded as a legitimate reason by the insurance company, right? And so it becomes also a barrier for people getting the proper care. There's also if we look at this on a kind of a macrocosm, and we look at how oppression plays out. So oppression can be done in 4 eyes. And so at the very top, we have ideological oppression, and that's how the world tends to think about things. And ideological oppression typically says one group of people is better than another group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we can see that out, like, you know, men are superior to women. That could be an example of ideological oppression. And that goes down into institutional oppression, right? And we can see institutional oppression kind of play out here because the institutions are not necessarily making a space for this, for these occurrences, right? To have race-based traumatic stress diagnosed, or institutional oppression looks like your teacher is being surprised at how articulate you are. Which goes into interpersonal oppression, where it plays out between people, right? Where it might play out between you and your teacher, right? Oh, Scott, you're so articulate, shocking, right? Down to internalized oppression. Why is this super important? Is because the system at the top, the ideological oppressor, has fundamentally done their job when the person at the lowest rung who is being oppressed internalizes it. Where it becomes an issue with diagnosis, if you diagnose someone with an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, it becomes a them thing. Something is wrong with me. When in fact, they are falling prey to a society that is inherently oppressive, that doesn't support them. But in the end, they believe it's about them when it's not a them thing to begin with.
That sounds like blaming the victim for being a victim versus, you know, I've always said that, you know, a thief can walk into your house to steal stuff, and then they blame you for having too many stuff to steal. So it almost seems like we are being blamed for the system, like for feeling how we're feeling. You know, this brings me back to one of the stuff that we talked about Drapetomania, and how it was seen that it was the slave wanting to run away, that was a symptom of a clinical symptom of something that's wrong with them. And you saying that reminded me of that if I'm feeling stressed because of race-based biases and my experiences, then it becomes like this is a me problem versus this is a systematic problem. But since we're talking about systems in general and the insurance company, I noticed a question here is how do we integrate, how do we address that with the insurance companies, with medical agencies like the AMA or I'm not and many other medical agencies and organizations? Like how do we integrate that into the medical billing, into a diagnosis? Could be DSM-5 added to that, or like how do we get there? Do we have to address the issue first? Does everybody have to say, oh yes, this is race? Well, for one thing, we have to get everybody on the same consensus that racism does exist. Not everybody will say systematic racism exists. Do you agree?
I think that this is where, where people could, also add into their thoughts into the chat. But I know one thing that we can do is advocacy. And believe it or not, I have found that insurance, especially in companies like insurance companies and payers, there is a trend towards more movement towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know for myself, when I started my practice, one of the insurance companies said, you cannot have therapists bill under your license unless you're a practice of more than 10 therapists. And to me, I see that as an issue, right? Because that is an issue of power and privilege, because we know certain groups of people have more access to wealth, they have more access to work capital, and I'm not going to necessarily go down that road. But what I did is I went to this insurance company and I said, hey, we have some people who are asking for services, and actually one of the people is a suicidal Black veteran. And there are people who, with your insurance type, who need services, who are suicidal. I have therapists with availability, but due to your arbitrary rule of how big we have to be, I can't serve them. And if something happens to them, it is on you. And through that, then they had to get back to me, they had to consult with their lawyers. And then I got this amazing email saying that they would allow my clinicians billing under my license. They would allow for their services. The insurance would pay for the services. So I do want to say advocacy, having voices, working in community. We need to work together, and it's a long process, right? And things are starting to change, and sometimes it's 6 steps forward and 12 steps back, but we need to continue to advocate. And I think that we can make change. And I know I don't necessarily want to see race-based traumatic stress entirely as what we call a traditional diagnosis, because again, I don't think that's going to help with the internalized oppression. Oh, this is a me thing, but how can it be something situational that someone's experiencing that the insurance companies are willing to pay for? Like, that's kind of where we need it to be. I don't want to see someone kind of holding this like, oh, I've got race-based traumatic stress. This is like PTSD. It is like PTSD, but I don't want it to further internalize someone's experiences of oppression.
So speaking of that, about internalizing, because of colonialism, obviously, you can't help but internalize oppression, right? You live in the system. After you've lived in it long enough, it's in your lungs. It's in your whole body. It's circulating through your blood, and sometimes you don't realize that what you're doing is internalizing racism, because I can tell you that You've probably heard the saying, uh, not all skin folk is kinfolk, right? And because of internalizing oppression, we might do something because, it's the norm. That's what happens, and not realize that you're doing that. Like one of the things that a lot of us here in this country and as well as in the Caribbean and South America fight with is colorism. That's a form of internalized oppression where it's based on the skin color. Um, but also, how do we internalize this oppression with our colleagues and not realize that we are doing that? Because sometimes when you call people out on racism, like for example, if you call a black person out, that's kind of what you're doing to me or to them is kind of like prejudice and racist. And they would say, but I'm black. I can't be racist, right? How how do we address something like this? And because that itself can also be traumatic because let's say it was me that did that. I acted on somebody's race who is also black. It impacts them, which causes them to look at me in a way and uh, not like me, think badly about me, and I myself in turn think badly about them because it becomes like two heads butting without realizing the source of that is internalized racism.
There's a few things to unpack here. And so going back, and because you had asked about like, well, one, how do we know if we're internalizing something? And so let's talk about like what that might look like and how you
Okay.
can maybe do a self-assessment. And so if you're experience increased vigilance and suspicion, so suspicions of social institutions, schools, agencies, government, only trusting people within your social group and family, increased sensitivity to threat. So maybe avoiding new situations, heightened sensitivity to being disrespected and shamed, and avoidance of risk taking. There's increased psychological and physiological symptoms that you're experiencing oppression. It looks like chronic stress, decreased immune functioning, which I'm going to come to in a minute, limbic system dominance, anxiety, depression, and also disruption of child development. And I wanted to go back to the decreased immune functioning because when they said that COVID disproportionately impacted Black and Brown folks, it did. But also another factor of that is that when we're in chronic stress and we're activating our amygdala, which is that fight, flight, or freeze, right? Our body's not digesting food because the blood's like in our arms and our limbs, and we have decreased immunity. So that means people who are consistently oppressed and chronically oppressed are more susceptible to contracting COVID. So I just wanted to name that.
Yes.
Increased alcohol and drug use, increased aggression. So domestic violence, engagement in gang activity, and then also a narrowing sense of time. And to me, this one is so heartbreaking. People living in a chronic state of danger and a chronic state of oppression tend not to develop a sense of future. So I wanted to answer that part of how do we know if we're being oppressed? And so if you're listening to this and you're finding that you're experiencing any of this, and oppression doesn't have to be based on the color of your skin. It can be based on your gender. It can be based on your sexual orientation. It can be based on so many things. It can be based on your age, if you're young or if you're considered elderly. It can be based on your socioeconomic status. And so it looks different and there's varying degrees. And I can say confidently, most people experience oppression. When it comes to managing things, as you're talking about these interpersonal interactions, how we experience harm is how we experience harm, right? And so sometimes it is difficult to name that we're being harmed, but if we don't name that we're being harmed, people don't learn. But it is the most important thing for people who are causing harm, and even if they don't intentionally do so, even those people are think they're complimenting you on being articulate, right? It is their job to hold a posture of non-defensiveness, being open to learning, saying, hey, I caused harm. I recognize I caused harm. I didn't mean to, but I'm going to hold and own that I caused harm, and I'm going to seek and I'm going to learn to do better next time. It doesn't solve everything, but it is a way to begin. So we all have a responsibility. We're all capable of causing harm. And so we therefore need to own when we do, especially if we're being called out for being discriminatory.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's always a good idea for you, whenever somebody calls you out on whatever it is, regardless of how highly you think of yourself, always good to reflect back on what you experienced the day to see if some of this is true, and what part of it, or if not all of it, can be changed wholesomely, just to make you more wholesome and more a community person, just to avoid that from happening in the future. But the thing about race-based traumatic stress is that it's not like physical trauma, just very much like mental health. You can't see it. Because you can't see it, people tend to be a little bit less apathetic towards it, and unless you call it out, but that is sometimes hard for people to do, because like, for example, right, there's a trope, if you speak out, if you're a Black woman, then you are called out a mad Black woman, right? And people are also afraid to say something because they don't want to be pulling the race card. I can speak about myself growing up. And whenever I would hear somebody pull out the race card, I myself being Black and them themselves also being Black or of another BIPOC community, I always ask myself, was it really because of, like, that's what you mentioned earlier regarding internalized oppression. And I realized that was something that I might be doing to others when I question them, if it was actual racism. It's almost like questioning a woman saying, oh, were you actually raped? Did you really experience sexual harassment? Which is not kind at all. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of us become that way is because the other side, the one that's oppressing you, questions you, saying, oh, is this really about race, or is it because you're doing poorly at your job? You could do your job better, or X and Y, Z could have been done better. And so I think people can be a little bit apprehensive in calling out what they know and feel in their bones is racism, because they don't want to be that person.
That's
It's
called
uncomfortable.
attributional. So that's called attributional ambiguity, right? When you know and feel in your bones, but you're not sure whether or not you're at the receiving end of it. And I think, though, it matters less, right? Sometimes it matters less if harm is being caused, harm is being caused. Right. And so if you're feeling it in your bones, and then it can sometimes, if it's safe, it's not always safe, or if there's a power differential to your boss, sometimes you can't name it, right? Could be other implications, but if it is a safe enough environment to do so, then it's important to call it out. But it's also if it's done where people can witness it, it's really important for people who are allies or bystanders to actually step up and say something. I also want to challenge, though, your notion that we can't see race-based traumatic stress because it's not manifest, like it's not a physical thing, but that's untrue, right? Because as you said, that manifests in things like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and also asthma. And so I want to bring up asthma is because, you know, when our government was red zoning where, you know, certain demographics could live somewhere and other demographics could live in another place. Black people have historically been barred from, you know, property ownership, owning homes, or the ability to get funding to own homes. And so one thing that happened to separate neighborhoods is that they would build the city bridges intentionally really low.
Mm-hmm.
So Black folks on the city bus, the buses couldn't fit under the bridges. Now, under the bridges and through, right, to these white neighborhoods were all these beautiful parks, shrubbery, and greenery, which were less in the Black parts of town. So what happened? Children developed asthma. So here's an act of intentional racism, discrimination, and oppression, which manifested into a physical symptom. And so I know we tend to say, well, we can't see it, but if practitioners did deeper digging, we would see very clearly that it has a physical manifestation. And not only that, it has been shown that racism contributes to weathering, oppression contributes to weathering of the body, so premature aging. And then also that influences our epigenetics. So not only that, is that it's passed down, our trauma is passed down through our genes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna look at the chat here, and I saw a question that that talked about well-meaning white people. So it says well-meaning white people could lead to passive trauma, since we see them as friends and as allies. And I can see where this our audience is coming from here is a lot of people who claim themselves to be very progressive will never think of themselves as being racist. Like the professor that I mentioned to you earlier, probably stands on a lot of progressive idealism, but might not have realized that what he or she said could relate to racial bias. Probably, you know, like I mentioned earlier, probably was well-meaning, but at the same time lead to chronic traumatic stress.
You know, and that's the thing though. There's also though a difference between being racist and being prejudiced, and we need to name that as well. So, for example, we can all be racist, right? And that's sometimes in how we vote. We can engage in things that cause oppressive policy. When we think about things like prejudice, we're talking about bias. And so people can have unexamined bias. And one thing we can do is that we can all have bias related to prejudice. How do we know if we have bias related to prejudice? Is if we ever engage in the use of stereotypes. And if you think about all the stereotypes, you might think about Black people.
Whether it's positive or negative, right?
Positive or negative. Asian people, LGBTQ people, elderly people. Here's one woman. Woman can't drive, right? So there's a prejudice. And so we have to think about when we are we're lumping groups of people together and saying that this is a known fact about them and that they all act in the same way. That's all of us engage. That's a way we engage in prejudice. And so it does exist. And no matter who you are, you can engage in racist action, and you can also engage in prejudiced thought.
Let's see here. So we have more questions regarding the insurance company, and when you brought up your experience with the insurance company, I myself can see this to be something that's that could be depleting in your energy, to having to fight just for that with every insurer. And so somebody said that changing the insurance system may be something for health for health committees to work on leveraging the power of therapists and the stories, like the stories that you are telling. So you mentioned advocacy earlier, and so you individually advocated for your patient, and I think a lot of people in healthcare individually do that for the patients, doctors, nurses, and etc. They feel like the patient needs more caring or adequate caring. Is but that can become very depleting in your energy. How can we approach this more wholesomely?
I have to say though, yes, I guess advocacy can be depleting. However, I don't think so I was in this case is not a specific patient, right? We had patients, but I was advocating for my practice. So I was not only advocating for me, I was advocating for the therapists that work for me. I was advocating systemically. And to me, I actually find, and it kind of hits those reward centers in my brain, when I can see change happen. And so it's something that drives me. So yes, it can be tiresome and depleting. And also on the other end, it can be very rewarding. How to offset some of that, though, is that we really have to take care of ourselves and just kind of being mindful of time. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about like steps to healing.
Okay.
And I also want to talk about something that's incredibly important, is that we all are familiar with the term resiliency. And I am telling you that complimenting somebody who on their resiliency, oh man, you're just so resilient, you're just so brave. Oftentimes, if we have a marginalized identity or an aspect of us is marginalized or discriminated against, it's not because we're so brave that we're showing up, is that we have to show up because we don't have a choice, because we're living and breathing. So this is not, when I talk about paths to healing, we're moving from the paradigm from being resilient to the paradigm of improving our vitality. That is the goal, is
We want to
moving into
thrive.
vitality.
Yes.
Yes, yes. And so what are things that we can do is really attending to our basic needs where we can, and also attending to our basic needs, again, leans into privilege. Not everyone has capacity to attend to their basic needs, like eating food that is nourishing and healthy. Unfortunately, those who live in food deserts who don't have access to good food, this could be very difficult and challenging. So we can contribute maybe more fresh produce to pantries and stuff, but what are things we can do is attending to our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles, making sure we're getting plenty of rest, making sure we're moving our bodies, taking time out. What does that mean? Maybe if you're not afraid of being in nature, some folks are, right? But like going outside, just being in the grass, if you can find a place that's grassy, taking a break from social media. There's a lot of toxicity in
On
social
social
media.
media.
Yeah. Engaging in community is so important. We know one of the number one killers of folks can also be isolation. And so if community feels good and right to you, that's wonderful. But the thing is, community doesn't have to be other people. I work with someone whose community is their plants. Community can be animals. So practice just not being alone, and practice being with the things or the people that you love, things that fill your cup. Being vital means putting yourself first. And oftentimes people tell me, when I tell people to put yourselves first, they're like, Nicole, that's so selfish. I could never put myself first.
Yeah.
When you put yourself first, you are filling your own cup. A poor person cannot make another poor person rich, but a rich person can help to lift a poor person. So if we're filling our cups and fulfilling our vitality and fulfilling our own abundance, then we can help to lift and raise community.
I totally agree with that. You can't operate on a half-filled cup and then try and help others, because then your cup, your half is diminishing. But a question that is in the chat is, in the moment that you are experiencing something that is obviously racist, doesn't have to be dramatically racist, where somebody's calling you out your name or anything like that, but it's clear that there's some type of racism or racial bias going on. is there a way to prevent that from becoming coming back later in life as manifesting as PTSD, as something that's internalized, and you become mad and angry, and perhaps even seeing people who might be allies as potential, you know, covert enemies or whatever. Is there a way to prevent that from, or maybe not prevent, but reduce the impact of that happening in the future?
That's a super hard question. You know, when we talk about things like race-based traumatic stress, right, it's ongoing and frequent, right? And so you can experience an incident, but it is likely that you're going to experience another incident, right? And so that's where that weathering effect comes in. And so it's really hard. And so it can be hard to be preventative sometimes when it's just ongoing, this like onslaught. But things that I do suggest and do recommend is not being okay with what happened, but acknowledging and being okay with what you feel. If you feel anger or rage, feel that anger and rage. And it's not little, you know, and people are like big T, little t, but you know, for the person experiencing harm, if you experience harm, then you experience harm. Allow yourself to feel those feelings. And if you feel that you are struggling to kind of get out of those feelings, right, then seek help from loved ones or friends, or if not, you know, that's why, you know, I'm here, you know, get help from a professional that can help to guide you through this, to help to reclaim a sense of self, to help to guide you back to vitality. Do what you need for yourself when those moments occur, right? Whatever that might be. And so like maybe it's getting something warm to drink, or nurturing yourself if you're able, co-regulating with another person. What does that mean? It means attuning to another person who's safe, who feels safe to you. And so those are things that you can do. But it is most important to attend to your needs, because if you can attend to your needs in that moment or subsequent moments, it does reduce the chances of developing PTSD.
While you're saying this, I'm thinking to myself, what if the need for you to deal with this, to feel better, is to hurl out a bunch of expletives and then walk away?
Why not? Whatever you need. I mean, if someone's being aggressive with you in a earlier says, you might not want to hurl at them, right? You don't want to put yourself in violent danger. But yes, if you need to walk away and scream, however it works for people, is the best thing that they should do. But definitely self-attendance is incredibly critical.
So I have a question here from somebody from she says that I'm glad we're having this conversation. She's a child adolescent psychology fellow at McLean, which is here in Massachusetts. And I wanted to raise a question specifically about helping younger patients understand trauma as something that happened to them rather than something that personifies them. Trauma, as we know, can oftentimes be a set of circumstances that a child, especially marginalized children, endure. And I often see children believe that because of their trauma, they must behave in a certain way. How do we use awareness in a way that encourages growth?
I think the answer is in that comment within itself. And just reading that comment that's such a rich comment, and there's so much there. And the participant that wrote that already sounds like that they have a high awareness of what is going on. And so it's really encouraging those children, raising awareness into those children so they don't internalize it. And it sounds like Kayla, you're already doing a fantastic job. And so it's really spreading what you're doing and maybe teaching your colleagues to do the same as you.
And thank you, Kayla, for adding that book regarding epigenetics, post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. Okay. Strong Black woman. Yep, that's another trope. Another thing that I hear a lot is you know, Black women are the backbone of our community, but yet Black women are the most underserved community. So they're being oppressed both on their gender and their race. But how, like, I've attended a lot of talks in the past where we talk about microaggressions, a term I personally dislike because aggression is aggression. You know what I mean? To me, it's the same thing as saying pregnant. You know, are you a little pregnant? Are you big pregnant? Or are you just pregnant? You're just pregnant, right? So let's just call it for what it is, you know, because I'm pretty sure those names, microaggression, as Nicole has mentioned earlier, they have much bigger impact that are not at all micro. But I guess the question that I was going to be asking is, let's see, I guess that was it. Yeah, I guess that's it for the questions with our chat. But the question that I wanted to ask personally is how do we, like I myself, I can say, for example, that I lived in New Hampshire for a while and working in my profession, and I know that I've come across a lot of patients who question if I should be here or not. Very similar to back in the slave days, you know, where they're asking for your papers, right? Are you really a pharmacist? Even though I am the only person in the pharmacy with a white coat that says pharmacist on it. How do you deal with that? And I've been in talks before in the past where I feel like the response that I've been given on how to deal with it is ask questions like, oh, what do you mean about that? To me, that's a little bit too passive because what I'm experiencing right now is not passive. Why would I want to deal with it in a passive way? Should I deal with it in a passive way? Should I question them? Like, what do you mean by that? When you say these words, please tell me more. What would we do in a situation like this? Like, for example, you're very articulate. Would I say, what do you mean by that? Or how would I deal with that in the moment?
I think how one deals with it is really dependent on the person, right? If you feel like asking a question is too passive, then I would probably not suggest asking questions. And I kind of this idea though, so one of the tenets of white supremacy is the right to comfort. But the truth is that we typically grow in discomfort. And so sometimes I know for myself when I experience it, if I'm not experiencing attributional ambiguity, meaning it takes me a while to process what just happened to me. But in that moment, if I can name it, I will just name it. You know, it happens a lot. People have come to our practice, you know, folks that will say, oh, you know, just so you know, I'm not a person of color, but I really, I want to work with someone because they really understand what it's like to experience low socioeconomic status. I've seen that more than once. So they want to work with us because they believe, because we're primarily Black practice, is that we all have super deep experiences with poverty, which is untrue because most of the people I work with are therapists. And so there's some level of privilege there for them to be able to get to graduate school. Not all, but some.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really sometimes naming it that like harm is caused, or saying, you know, that not even feels, but that is assumptive to state, or
Yeah.
it appears to be an assumption on your part that because we're Black that we've automatically experienced poverty. So sometimes it's just naming it in your lab coat.
Yeah.
You know, there appears to be an assumption that because I'm Black, you think I can't be a pharmacist, but you have to kind of moderate that against the context, right? If you got, you know, like a boss there or something, right? And they're like, well, why are you too confrontational? You can lose your job. So it's placed in
Right.
context.
Yeah. You know, it's funny that you mentioned poverty. I know recently in a lot of the news, um, the context regarding policies regarding criminal justice is important to Black people, it kind of puts you in the trope that all Black people are criminals. Not all Black people will care about criminal justice if they haven't experienced it, or if it's not a thing in their family or their community. And like this recent assumption regarding our past president who is running again this year is that, oh, Black people love me because I'm being screwed by the system just like you are. These are the things that is really triggering to me. These are one of the nicks that, as you mentioned, that we experience on a day-to-day basis. But I do want to ask you a question before we end, since we are talking about ourselves and we are talking about our allies. So how can our allies and supporters help people of color heal? Like, what can they do? And what can we do to help them overcome their healing? Because I know a lot of times when something bad is happening, they will look at you and say, well, Scott, you must know what's going on. Educate us on how to help you. So what would you say to that? The question is, how do our allies and supporters help? How can our allies and supporters help people of color heal?
Sure. And also just recognizing the time. If anyone has any last questions, put it in the chat, but people, please feel free to leave and we'll consider it concluded just because it is past 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
But what people can do, what allies can do to help people heal is that don't leave it up to the person experiencing discrimination to be the one to have to call out the discrimination. So that's the very first thing. So if you're witnessing something, please step up. Recognize where you have power, recognize where you have privilege, and use that power and privilege to create change. Maybe that's in advocacy, maybe that's in activism, maybe that's in policy making, maybe that's engaging in different communities to understand them a bit more. But it's recognizing where you have the most power, where you have the most influence, and using that power and influence to lift up people who might have less power and influence than you. And then also doing a deep dive on, if you don't know where you hold power and influence, because we all do have some degree of power and influence, doing a deep dive, understanding the intersections of your identity.
Thank you for answering that. I think that's very strong what you just said just right now. Well, like Nicole just said, it is 1 o'clock. It's actually 1:10 right now. It's a very engaging conversation, and I would like to continue this. We can go on all day, every day, because we experience a lot of trauma all the time. And it's like one of my colleagues said one time in one of our conversations with Nicole is that, I'm too busy trying to survive this life with work and school and family to have to deal with this racist stuff. But the reality is that we do. Thank you for coming today. I don't know if you want to give some last comments, Nicole, about some takeaways from this. If you do, you can go ahead and do that. If not, we'll make some announcements.
Yeah, I don't have any final comments.
Okay, excellent. All right.
Thanks, Scott and Nicole. I really appreciate this. It's been a great discussion, and we've had a really good response. I just want to add, and I put it in the chat, one of the ways allies can help is to go to a long talk. It's on the web, and they can actually get training on steps they can take moving forward to deal with issues of racism and help people out. It's been a great workshop. It's part of a series the Manchester NAACP Health Committee does. If you go to Manchester NAACP website, we have a YouTube channel where this and all our other past workshops get posted, as well as other YouTube videos that we have there we think you'll find of interest. Also, on just a couple other things coming up, June 29th, statewide, there'll be readings of Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." You can go to our Manchester website to find out about that. It's going to be held at City Hall Plaza in Manchester, but they're all over the state. And if you want to sign up to speak, you can go to our website, Manchester NAACP, and you can actually be one of the readers of this speech, and it's a powerful speech.
Very powerful.
On August 17th, at the We Are One Festival, Manchester NAACP and the Black Women Health Project will co-sponsor a health fair, and we will have mental health as the main topic, the main focus of that. And so we'll be talking about some of these same things, and again, talking about some of the self-care techniques that people can use. And finally, and importantly, once a month, Nicole and other members of her practice host a healing circles program through Manchester NAACP. And those are, Nicole, I don't know if you want to say anything in particular about it, but those are BIPOC only, to sit and talk with each other about these very issues and how racism affects folks. And Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to say something else about that.
I do. And so what we're doing is racial healing circles, and they're going to be held once a month, every third Tuesday and Wednesday at 7 p.m. And a healing circles is incredibly beautiful. It's really a space where you can just share what's on your heart and to be witnessed. And there's a lot of powerful healing in that. And there's also community in that. So I encourage anyone who resides in the state of New Hampshire, who identifies as BIPOC, to please join us in this space. It's free to you. And it's a really good place to ground, center, and kind of heal what we're talking about here, that weathering effects from race-based traumatic stress.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the steps to healing, right?
Community and connection. One of the critical steps. Well, I think that covers everything. So thank you for attending. We really appreciate your coming today. And again, to Scott and Nicole, and if you want to, we can't see you, but thank you for being here. And from all the comments, it sounds like people really enjoyed this and really appreciated it and want to talk about it more.
Yes. Before we go, there is a workshop coming up. So the NAACP, the health committee portion of the NAACP Manchester branch, we try and do these workshops as frequently as possible. And right now we are in our mental health series, and we do have another workshop coming up in the fall. It's called Mental Health First Aid. If anybody knows anything about first aid, you need to learn how to do first aid on somebody if they're experiencing some type of event, doing CPR, the Heimlich maneuver. These are all considered first aid type of maneuvers. But we often don't talk a lot about recognizing when mental health first aid needs to be utilized. So that's one of the things that we'll be addressing as well. We'll be having a workshop on that sometime in the fall. It'll be announced on our page and on all the social medias. So look out for that as well. And if you want to get in touch with Nicole, she's with Therapists of Color New England. She has a website up for her clinic. If you want to get in touch with her and speak to her some more, you can always email her or give her a call, 603-787-3140.
We've got a question in the chat there about healing circles.
Oh, it's asking if someone in Massachusetts can come to them. Of course, they're all online. It's an online experience. It's open to everyone.
All right, if there is no more question, we'd like to thank you a lot for coming today. And of course, we can't do this work without you. We would love your help. Become a member, join the various different committees that we have. The NAACP has various different committees in regards to education, criminal justice. What else am I missing? Health,
Environment, health.
finance, mental health. Exactly. So whatever floats your boat, I'm pretty sure we can find there's a place for you, no matter what. So that's one of the best things you could do is become a member and participate in one of our committees. If you cannot do that because of time, you can contribute and donate and help support some of our efforts because we have done a few things in the past relating to healthcare. I don't know if you wanted to mention that, Tracy, about our COVID vaccine efforts back when, well, it sounds like back when, as if it was a long time ago, but it was only like 3-4 years ago when COVID was a thing. Again, the recording from this video, from this workshop will be sent to you in a few days to your email address that you provided. But it can also be accessed on our YouTube channel if you are interested or if you wanted to share it with others as well. So without any further ado, if there's no more questions, we will say have a good weekend.